Well, and I think this ties back to the earlier conversation we're having on complexity, right? Because you said it's how much revenue they're producing per unit of selling time, right? Let's say per hour of selling time. Well, complexity is eating away at that selling time. And so that's one argument for reducing that. You are introducing more of that quality time for them to actually do the work or to plan. I mean, that's a great point. There's so much, especially, and anyone that's working any even remotely complex deal knows, like, so much of the work is that. It's not the call, it's not the email you're sending, but it is all of the research, all of the planning, all of the connection points, the positioning that you're thinking of doing. And that's what I was coming back to earlier in saying that context shifting and making sure that the time that you have, because if you're burnt out after all the admin work that you have to do, well, guess what? You're probably not going to be your sharpest when you need to do some of that strategic work.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. That was Pouyan Salehi. Pouyan is the CEO and co-founder at Scratchpad. And in our conversation, Pouyan and I dig into why he believes that complexity is the enemy of performance in sales, and why complexity is the reason revenue teams struggle with quota. So we dig into it. We explore what are the causes of this complexity. Is it self-inflicted? Too many tools in the tech stack? We also dive into how this complexity complicates the life of both enablement and RevOps teams as they try to drive behavior changes across the sales organization. So we get into all of this and much, much more. But before we get to Pouyan, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So let's jump into it. Pouyan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, I think you're a member of the three-timer club. I think it's your third appearance, at least your third appearance.
Yeah, so, I think that sounds about right. I'm excited to be back.
Yeah. Well, your first appearance even preceded when you started Scratchpad. So
yeah.
All right. So for people who aren't familiar with you or Scratchpad, why don't you tell us about you and about Scratchpad?
Sure. So I'm Pouyan. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Scratchpad. Been building companies. With my co-founder Sarus, we've been together for 10 years across quite a few products, quite a few companies. Learned a lot and still doing it and having a lot of fun doing it. And Scratchpad is what we call the first workspace for salespeople and revenue teams. And it started simply from an observation that we saw that most organizations have a CRM and a ton of tools connected to it, and AEs are overloaded with tools. Yet,
right.
If you look at how they work, almost everyone has the same pattern. It's a spreadsheet for pipeline and account management. Notes are in Mac Notes or Evernote or OneNote. Tasks are all over the place. And so that's where people do their work. And then, Friday mornings, weekends are dedicated to updating the pipeline for managers so they stop complaining and they have it for forecasting. So really, that was the observation. And then everyone accepted that as an okay state of the world. And we questioned it. We said, well, why do other crafts have studios or workspaces designed just for them? Mm-hmm. And why do salespeople not have that? And so that's what we set out to create.
Got it. So, you're sort of known for making it easy to do all those things that you described, which I guess starts sort of fighting back a little bit at the complexity, I guess, around selling. Because some things that you've written and so on, you sort of identified complexity as the enemy of performance, or as a reason why teams struggle with quota even. So why is that?
I think complexity is the enemy of execution, which then leads to performance. And gosh, that's a great question. Why is that? Well,
yeah, so what is it about complexity that has an influence? And we'll talk about this. I got ideas about how complexity, influences poor sales execution or results in poor sales execution. But let's dive into that, because I think, as you talk about, you've questioned certain assumptions in building Scratchpad. I do this constantly in the show. What are the assumptions that we're questioning there?
Yeah, well, I think if you look at sales in general as a role, as a job to be done,
Mhm.
And forget selling as part of a team, right? Just look at the world of an individual seller and imagine that was the entire business. That alone, it's a very complex job to do, right? You have try to find new customers to sell to, try to manage how you're reaching out to them, whether they're the right customers, try to manage your existing customers and selling to them and finding the right people there and staying organized. So it is just a very fast-paced, complex job to be done in the first place. And now it's just one person. So now take that, but then apply it as part of a larger organization, right? And you can scale that up everywhere from like a startup that has 10 salespeople all the way to public companies that might have tens of thousands of salespeople. And what you're trying to do there is get an organization to sell. Well, getting an organization to sell adds multiple layers of complexity to it. Because it's not just that same level of complexity that exists for one person, but now you're introducing a dimension of human complexity. We're all wired differently. We all process information differently, communicate differently, work differently. So there's that layer. Then there's the complexities in systems, right? And how do you get all these systems to work together? And then there's complexities in processes. How do you get all these processes to work together? And so that's what it just, it feels like the slightly larger the organization gets, the more it just feels like, gosh, you are trudging through mud and ice just to get anything done. And it's a pattern that I've seen in every single organization, right? It feels like this gravity that exists that's just pulling everyone towards that.
Well, so the question I guess I have is I was thinking about this yesterday as I was preparing for our interview is have we made things unnecessarily complex? Right? I mean, we'll look at the basic task, sales is a job to be done. I mean, I spent years of my career selling really complex systems, high dollar, 7-8 figure deals. We had the same tasks. We had to go through the same processes to everything that you identify in terms of identifying potential customers and supporting existing customers, selling, getting buy-in from the buyer, so on and so forth. And did it with, a lot less in the way of technology, which wasn't necessarily optimal, but it just didn't exist for the most part at that point. But we're doing the same basic jobs now. And not saying we don't need the technology, but are we using them in such a way that we're making things more complex than they need to be? Because I think there is a price to be paid in terms of execution. So.
Well, the belief that I have is things gravitate more towards complexity than they do towards simplicity. Trying to make something simple actually requires a lot of effort. It's hard work, right? So if you have that belief, then you would say, over time, things do become more complex. Now, if we can argue if nature were to run it, maybe not, right? There are a lot of systems in nature that exist that go more towards simplicity, but this isn't nature and natural evolution that's happening. This is people trying to make a business run. But I would say, in some ways, I think we absolutely have made things more complex. And then you can ask the question, well, why? And I don't know if anyone's intent is to say, I want to introduce complexity into the system here, like a RevOps organization coming in and saying, we want to make it as complex as we can for our people to sell. I think there's a tension that exists, right? Because there are, in some ways, you can think about two basic needs that exist. There's the needs of the business or the organization to operate and to grow. And then there are the needs of the folks on the front line to sell.
Right.
And it's these two needs that I feel like come into conflict with each other. And frankly, the people that have most of the power are the ones that are trying to solve for the needs of the business. So if we think about it, who are the folks with the ones with power? The ones that decide what processes go into place, the ones that decide, very tactically what fields go into Salesforce, what tools people should use. And the challenge that I've seen is a lot of the folks that carry that power and are the ones that make that decision, for the most part, are not well connected to the folks on the front line. And so when they make the decisions to introduce new things, whether it's new tools, new processes, what have you, that introduces unnecessary complexity to the folks on the front line, which slows them down. Because, and again, I don't think their intent is to do that. I just don't think that they may be thinking about it. They may not have the skills to do it because it is much more of a design thinking process. And I don't know the last time that I saw, an ops organization that had a design team.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think I put it slightly differently, which is, with I think one of the challenges with technology is, and one to your point about leaders not thinking these things through, which is just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And I think with all the new technologies that have come to bear, people just say, wow, this is cool. Let's do it. And let's use it. And while in isolation, there's certainly value, when you put together as part of a process that then, like I said, imposes a price of complexity on sellers, the individual sellers. Yeah, it's not really thought about that. It's just like, yeah, this is cool. Let's do this. And I think this is sort of a fundamental lesson with technology in general, is just because we can do something doesn't mean we should.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think it ultimately falls in the back of the sellers in many cases.
Yeah, which is unfortunate because they have a pretty hard job to do already. And then on top of that, it's, hey, check out this new tool, or guess what, we're rolling out this process. And all of a sudden you have all these other fields to fill out and do.
Yeah, or make this many calls or send this many emails, and we can go down the whole chain. It's like we sort of adopt these things sort of unquestioningly to some degree.
Yeah.
So complexity, just sort of getting back to that point then, is, and I think this is a lesson for RevOps and sales teams in general, is revenue teams, is that, at least in my mind, where complexity becomes the enemy of performance is really from a time perspective, right? Is just at a basic level, the less time a seller has to be thinking about their opportunities and working on the opportunities, the less opportunities they have to to do a good job on them.
I think time is certainly one factor, or one hit that complexity takes. But I think there's more to it, right? Because it's, yes, you certainly, the more complex something is, the harder it is to do, the more time it takes, and you just don't have time to do other things. But the piece that I've also seen across, I've personally felt when I've had to deal with things that are overly complex, and I'm seeing across organizations is, and this is going to sound really soft and fuzzy, but I believe it and I think it's real, is the emotional hit that it takes. And again, we're at the end of the day.
Emotional hit on the individual seller.
On the individual person, right? Because in some ways it's, you look at a sales organization and you think, okay, I have X number of sales people, they have this amount of time and they can sell. Well, guess what? They're also human. And so, yes, they may have that time, but one of the things that I struggle with in the job that I do is the context shifting. Mm-hmm. And when you have to shift context quite a few times, it drains your energy. And so the 8 hours or 10 hours you may normally have may actually look very different when you have to switch context a bunch of times. So I think while reduced time is certainly one, I think the emotional hit that it takes on your energy level, on your presence, on your ability to be effective in what you do is also another factor to consider with complexity, is that you just maybe, after having to update, let's say they roll out MedPick and it's all these fields in Salesforce that take forever to update, and then you click save and it was like, oh, sorry, someone else was updating and it's all gone. You have to come back and do it again. You're pretty damn frustrated at the end of that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then imagine if you have to go right into another customer call, like, are you in the right mindset? So again, I know it may sound soft and fuzzy, but I do believe that that energy that you bring into your work, the level of focus that you can bring into your work, has a strong impact on your performance. So I would add that as another factor to it too.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think certainly lots of studies done about time management, talk about the penalty you pay on time in terms of being able to resync back up when you're switching contexts is real, right? So how are you seeing revenue operations teams deal with this in terms of, okay, whether it's, hey, are we setting aside blocks of time to do certain tasks so people, per Cal Newport saying with deep work, saying, look, we got to be focused specifically on this task for uninterrupted, without context switching. How are they dealing with that?
Well, that's actually assuming that they are dealing with it.
Yeah.
Right. So let's maybe step back for a second.
Sure.
And I think almost everyone that I have talked to, probably everyone, but I'm not going to say it. I'm going to say almost everyone that I've talked to that's in RevOps or enablement. Listen, they're all feeling it. They know that things are overly complex. And what are the symptoms of it? What do they see? Well, the front line isn't necessarily following the process. They're not seeing that the data that they want in their systems, right? That's one piece, but they're also seeing it in their own worlds through all the tools that they have to manage, all of the integrations that they have to do, the massive backlog of projects that exists on every sales ops and rev ops team. It's nuts, right? Because there's all these initiatives that are changing at the business level. Yet the RevOps organization, or the folks that are responsible for implementing them, they can't keep up because it takes so long to make change management happen. And so I think they're feeling it, but I wonder if folks know that, okay, it is actually the complexity part that we need to solve. So I think the first step is just recognizing that this is a problem that needs to be solved in the first place versus just trying to run faster. So that's one.
Yeah.
And I think people are getting there. But so let's assume that there's a world of folks that see it and they're like, okay, this is a problem. What do we want to do about it? How are they solving it? Well, on one extreme, things I've seen are like, all right, let's take a very prescriptive lockdown approach. Like, we as a centralized team are going to dictate to you, the front line, exactly every single thing you can and cannot do, when you should do it. Everything is going to be prescribed to you. And
recipe for disaster.
Well, you would think, but there's still some folks that feel like that is the way to go. Other folks are trying to cut down, right? And I actually think the market turn is accelerating this. A lot of folks are stepping back and saying, what do we really need? Now, that's driven more probably by the CFO's office and saying, hey, we need to cut spend. And it's having a secondary effect on reducing complexity and saying, how can we consolidate some of these things? So right. I think there are very few organizations, I think, that are proactively trying to prune their systems and say, let's look at our entire system and let's see what's working, what's not for the front line. How can we reduce complexity? I don't think that's happening much just yet. There are a few organizations that I would say are doing that, but I'm finding them to be the few right now. I would anticipate that would probably change over the next few years.
But I would think that given the turn in the economic environment, that we are seeing the shift away from growth at all costs. And certainly in the software world, I haven't really seen it. It should result in, hey, a greater focus on sales execution. I'm not sure I've seen that take hold quite yet.
Not yet either. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think right now we're probably in the stage of tool reduction. Whereas before, when you're in the growth at all stage or growth at all cost stage, and let's say that comes down from the very, very top, from the board, from the investors saying, hey, you have all of this capital, deploy the capital so that it can turn into growth. And that drum is constantly being beat on. Well, the execution turns into, okay, well, let's spend. And so the threshold to buy something, to implement something goes down generally. It's like, well, we're willing to take a shot. Let's experiment. Let's see. Because what we really need to do is grow, and we have the money, and we're supposed to spend the money. And that's the directive that's being shared with us. Let's try a bunch of different things. Let's get a bunch of different tools. And I think now that's shifted a lot more to, whoa, we need to cut down. We need to reduce the spend. So a lot of those tools are going. And in some ways, I think it's a good thing for, I guess companies that are in a healthy spot, that have a lot of cash on their balance sheet can withstand this downturn, because it's forcing everyone to look in the mirror and say, hey, are we truly a must-have? Are we solving a meaningful enough problem to make the cut?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it seems like the question that rarely gets asked is, when we look at some of these things that create complexity within revenue teams, is by adding this tool, let's say, to our tech stack or whatever, or having this particular process, and you talked about behavior change before, the question that really gets asked is, well, how is doing this helping our buyer choose us?
I mean, that's a whole nother question. Let's introduce that.
But it seems like it should be the perspective that drives so many of those decisions. What are we doing? What's this particular motion that we're undertaking with this initiative? Mm-hmm. How is this helping our buyers choose us?
So, listen, I'm with you, and I think that that's right. But I would say that is actually more a function of the philosophy of the sales leader at the organization, in terms of whether they're actually buyer centric, customer centric. Hey, good sales is creating a good buyer experience, so they eventually do choose us. And in other organizations we've seen, it's much more, here's what we're doing. We're pounding the pavement. It's all about activity. We're go, right? And just pound through it. And so I think that introduces a new variable to say, yes, like how can you not only reduce complexity, but reduce complexity in a way that works for our front line and it works for creating a better buyer experience.
Yes.
There are not many organizations I've seen that are taking it to that level just yet.
Yeah, because I think if you're looking at sales execution, that sales organizations have to look at that perspective, right? And it's one that gets overlooked, and I'm been seeing more and more data recently about this, about surveys about why buyers actually buy. And yeah, it is the buying experience. It's not that drives it, more so than particular pricing, product, functionality, and so on.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen that. We've certainly won deals where folks just said, we just had such a delightful experience that we felt like this is going to translate into real value over the long run with us, right? If the experience for us was this great up front, then
what's going to be like on the backside?
We're not even customers yet. Then yeah. So, but I do think you're right in that because if you look at the landscape, there are now more and more tools than there ever have been. And you think of in any existing category, there are more tools, and yet there are new categories being created left and right. And those categories will certainly fill up with many competitors and tools. And I think that's a healthy thing. But a lot of folks do put the product first, as it's the set of features that is what is going to differentiate us and allow us to win in the market. And in our view, at Scratchpad, certainly one of the things that I drive with the team and saying the product is simply one leg of the stool for us. It is simply one channel for us to deliver an experience, but in the way that people interact with us, in the way that people explore how they might solve certain problems using the product that we have built, that is yet another opportunity for us to create a delightful experience for them. So again, I try to, yeah.
Well, I was going to say, do you as a CEO, when you look at your product, do you look at it from the perspective of, anything that we do, the barriers to entry are pretty low. And so anything we do, other people can do reasonably quickly, or they're doing so. Back to the point we were talking about before, this overall experience of how the buyer experiences our company really has to become paramount in the way we look at how we go to market.
Absolutely. I mean, not just in how we go to market, I think in how we build this entire organization, how we build a company.
Yes.
Why should we even build anything here? And in some ways, I don't know how much my product team is going to appreciate this, but no, the reality is, at least in the world that we live in like SaaS applications, it's hard to find a tech moat. It's hard to find true differentiation through technology. You can tell yourself all day long you have it. I think there are very few circumstances that I've seen that there really is a true technology moat. So I think you're right. Well, if that doesn't exist, then what does? Why might somebody pick you over others? And eventually that comes down to brand. And outside of tech in the consumer world, I mean, that is very well known. But if you get to the essence of brand, what makes a brand? It's how other people talk about you, right? Well, why might they talk about you? They're either going to talk about you because they had a really crappy experience, which is not the brand that you want, or they're going to talk about you because they had a truly delightful experience. So that, I follow that logic and say, well, and delight is one of our core values at the company that we've set. And we set it from day one. We talk about it actively. I'm constantly thinking about it in ways that we can design it, that we can deliver it. And I view it as just as important as a pillar as the product that we create and we ship into the world.
Yeah. Well, no, I love that. I mean, it's sort of taking a step back, we were talking before, is it's never been easier to really understand what the buyer's expectations are of this experience or what this experience should be. Mm-hmm. Yet it's this huge yawning chasm that I see when I talk to sales leaders, as I do all the time on this show and other places, is really making the effort to understand what those expectations are, right? I mean, and you talk about jobs to be done I think sales is a job to be done. I think customers hire salespeople to help them make a decision. And if you're hiring someone, don't you have certain expectations and requirements in mind?
Yeah.
And that I've never to date, I would say never, almost never run into a sales leader who said, when I asked the question, so before you go hire those next few people on your sales team, have you talked to your buyers of what they need your sellers to be to help them? And that question just doesn't get asked. But if you're trying to create this experience for the buyer, you want to be mindful of that.
It's a good question. I wonder why, though. I wonder why that's not a question. Have you gotten any feedback?
It doesn't occur to people. It's just never occurred to them. Well, we're hiring the salespeople for our needs. It's like, no, you're not. You're hiring the salespeople to help buyers make a purchase decision. So what are the things that buyers need in sellers in order to help them get their job done? And it doesn't mean that's exclusively what you look at, but it's just as some of the factors you take into account. What are those attributes that they need? And when you ask, they'll tell you.
So do you think that, if we follow that thread, then
sure,
it seems to me that the profile of folks you would be looking for in that case, or to say, hey, at least maybe in the SaaS world in general, it is leading much more to a consultative sale. Is that something? It's okay.
Yeah. I mean, certainly there's some products that are more transactional. We know that, but you have to look at the reason why buyers choose to talk with salespeople. Because I'm of the belief, if they could do it all by themselves and feel confident in the decision, they would. But self-aware buyers know that the value of salespeople is they can ask them questions they don't think to ask themselves, to help them better understand the problems and the challenges they face and potential outcomes they can achieve. So, they probably have in mind, somebody an ideal person that could help them with that. And I just think it's, these are factors that we need to factor in when we're hiring people. It's not hiring for our quote unquote, conform with our culture. Sure, fine. But is your culture really helping the buyer get their job done? Which is all they're concerned about. My job, gather and make sense of information I need to make a good decision with the least investment of my time, attention, and resources possible.
Yeah, that is something I do agree with. And I do see some companies, at least in their marketing, what you can see externally is so much about them, and look how great we are as a company. Look how great our product is. And I'm usually not as a huge fan of that, but making it much more about why should somebody care? Why is it that somebody might trust your service or product to solve the problem that they have, and really getting into that mindset.
Well, I think you talked about brand. I think when seller or buyers, are engaged in a buying experience with a particular seller, the seller, to a large extent, is the brand.
Yeah. That I think that's a great point. and thinking about how your team, the folks on the front line, everyone, like anyone that's touching the customer experience is supporting the brand experience is a really, really, at least it's a point I care a lot about.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's, yeah. So when I think about this whole, we've been talking about sales execution, is get our way back to that yeah, I think this relates in the sense that, as sales organizations and as individual sellers, is they have to be much more aware of how they are being perceived by the buyer. And I think this is the next.
Do you see a lot of organizations putting that as a priority in their training and enablement?
Oh, not at all.
Okay.
So I look at training, and this is part of what I wrote about in my book, Sell Without Selling Out, is we need to do the sales training, the sales skills and the process training and the product training and the customer training. But in my mind, that's like 50% of the way done. Get to where you need to be. So the other part is, what are these human attributes that enable us to connect with buyers more effectively, build credibility and trust, to deploy our curiosity and ask better questions, and reach levels of understanding, through our listening that perhaps we weren't able to do before. Those aren't trained, by and large.
And I think that's a big opportunity, because I see a similar pattern as well, where a lot of the enablement, a lot of the training is focused just internally. Here are the processes to follow. Here's the deck to use. Here are the fields to update. And in the work that I do, I like to look outside of tech. I mean, I like to look as broadly as I can to look for patterns and start seeing what commonalities exist. But I feel like in this topic, we have a lot to learn from the hospitality industry. Because if you look at the training that they have and how folks at, the top hotels, the top food establishments, the entertainment establishments, so much of the training is on how do you interact with the client.
Yeah. And it makes a difference.
And it makes a huge difference, right? Even down to the detail of don't forget to smile. Right? Like, make sure that you are smiling when somebody is walking in the door or comes up to the desk, or when somebody's greeting you, and then in all the ways to approach conversations, or to how to ask questions. And again, all of those then feed back to what we were talking about earlier, which is how do you create a buyer experience? Now, again, that buyer experience can mean different things to different companies. But I think there's a lot to learn from that industry.
Well, and so I agree. And again, this is getting into what I had written about. I think one of the biggest sources of value that you provide to a buyer is making them feel understood. And who teaches that? Right? It's I've had many instances in my career in selling systems and things of 7-8 figure type deals, where as a startup I didn't think we had any chance of winning, because you're competing against these multinational corporations. And when you ask the customer why we won, it's because you're the only one that made us feel understood. I mean, when you give value to the things that are important to other people by understanding them, that really stands out. And it's just this mindset and this perspective, again, that we don't teach, is this, the reason I really want to understand the buyer and really make sure I truly understand is, I'm communicating to them that I value what they find to be important. Yeah. That's a differentiator. That's just one example.
Well, I think if we unpack why, at least my view on it is because it creates credibility when you do that, and it also creates a lot of trust. And I think that's one of the reasons why people are, to your point, the buying is a factor that may not necessarily be on the decision-making criteria that they have, because usually those are features. But, you could certainly bet that, do we trust this vendor? Do we trust this person that they will be there for us, and then we can work with them? And I think the feeling of being understood is certainly a big factor to that.
Yeah. And it's just one example, right, of sort of the, so I was written about is these using your innate human skills and being able to amplify those to bring your best self as a seller
Yeah.
to these interactions with buyers, because ultimately that's sales execution, right? I mean, a lot of people want to talk about sales execution in the context of a process, or we're going to execute our process. At the end of the day, the execution that matters is when, yeah, I'm across the seat from you, or I'm looking at you on the screen, and it's us. That's the execution that matters. And have we built that rapport? Have we built that connection? Have we built that level of trust where, you know, you want me to ask you certain questions and you are prepared to answer certain questions I ask that you wouldn't necessarily answer for, you know, any other salesperson that comes off the street if they haven't built that same level of connection, credibility, and trust.
That's right.
And so I think that we tend to look at execution too macro of a level still, and have forgotten that it really takes place one-on-one, right? And it could be one-to-many, but one-on-one. And that doesn't get enough attention from a training standpoint.
I think it's a good point, because if you say, you know, the mental model for most folks is probably sales execution equates to activities.
Yeah.
For the most part, right? Whether it's calls, dials, opportunities you're touching, what have you, but like that, how are you executing there? And I think what you're talking about is such an important point, is the execution of the actual interaction, and how are you executing that interaction with somebody?
Because it ultimately boils down, this would be a whole separate conversation we'd have on this, is your definition of productivity. Because I believe, and I've managed teams doing this in the past, is productivity is a function of revenue generated per unit of time. Let's say per hour of sales time.
Yeah.
That's your productivity. It's not how many calls you make. It's not how many emails you send. It's, as a salesperson, as an AE, how much revenue am I generating per hour of sales time? Because that then dictates what the productive capacity of an organization is. Because if you know what the productivity is in real terms of each of your sellers, your productive capacity is not, hey, quota's $1 million and we've got 10 people and, you know, 60% of them will make it and we'll discount that by 80%. And that's the number we should hit. That's not your productive capacity. Your productive capacity is, hey, these people actually generate on average, you know, X amount of dollars per hour of selling time. Assuming a certain amount of sales time for each individual, that's our capacity. And so what we do to improve and to grow is we help people become more productive when they're with the buyer. That's how we grow productivity.
Well, and I think this ties back to the earlier conversation we're having on complexity, right? Because you said it's how much revenue they're producing per unit of selling time, right? Let's say per hour of selling time. Well, complexity is eating away at that selling time. And so that's one argument for reducing that. You are introducing more of that quality time for them to actually do the work that they're
or just to think, right?
Or to plan. I mean, that's a great point. There's so much, especially, you know, and anyone that's working any even remotely complex deal knows, like, so much of the work is that. It's not the call, it's not the email you're sending, but it is all of the research, all of the planning, all the connection points, the positioning that you're thinking of doing. And, you know, that's what I was coming back to earlier and saying, that context shifting and making sure that the time that you have, because if you're burnt out after all the admin work that you have to do, well, guess what? You're probably not going to be your sharpest when you need to do some of that strategic work. Yeah.
And this is why, as I like to say, I've won all my big deals in the shower, because that's when I'm just sitting there thinking about them, right?
Yeah.
And I don't have anything else to think about. And this is where the ideas come. And, you know, to the point where I, you know, get a waterproof pad that I have in my shower to write notes on. It's like, yeah, it's happening then because you're not giving yourself time during the day.
Yeah.
There's a great book, came out. I had the author on the show, a woman named Juliet Funt. It's called A Minute to Think. I would highly recommend it. It's about how do you create what she calls white space in your day? And this is basically time that's unassigned to any task. And she just, she said, this is not time for meditation, or, this is just white space, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
God,
really interesting.
that's going to look on a calendar, right?
Well, hey, but that's
it's like, hey,
you need to own your calendar, right?
Yeah. But I'm just
it's the whole thing about, as you know, as an entrepreneur, it's, you're working in your business or on your business.
Yeah. Well, listen, yes, for me, I think that would make sense, but I'm imagining if I'm on the front line and I'm blocking time off on my calendar for quote unquote white space, how that might be perceived, but
that is the issue though, isn't it?
It is.
Right. Is so sellers operate in this idea, this perception of, and again, so one of the things I wrote about in the book is we have this culture of conformity that's sprung up in sales,
mm-hmm.
that somehow, everybody has to operate the same way. And we've got these unusual, expectations of busyness and other things that are sort of applied uncritically. And I think that one thing we have to change, right? Yeah. Everybody approaches their job differently. We're hiring individuals to be successful. How do we help these people become the best version of themselves? Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that we make them all or attempt to make them all into clones of each other, but how do we help them become the best individuals? So if somebody has time in their calendar, if the numbers are working, then yeah. Yeah.
And there are, and listen, you look at other functions or other roles inside of a company, and that pattern exists, right? So for the engineering team, for example, it's really important to have large blocks of time to do exactly what you're talking about, which is things, because you're trying to solve a problem and then get it to code. And I think there are certain parts of sales that probably are similar, except that problem is different. And so I think it's more, like you said, the approach to it, the mental model around it for folks appreciating that and saying, yes, like part of the job of sales here at this company, if that's the right approach, is it's not just about the number of dials and emails and calls and touch points, but maybe taking time to think and blocking that off is valued and encouraged.
Yeah, well, I think depending on the complexity of what you're selling, it doesn't, I think, require a great, let's say, assume you're not transactional in the product you're selling. You're going to assume some level of complexity, which means that I believe that part of the seller's role is to solve a problem for the buyer, right? The buyer has a challenge. They want a solution to that challenge. It can't always just be, hey, here's our product, this is what it does. You have to put it in the context. You have to create a vision around it, a story around it. Value proposition has to make sense. Requires thought. Salespeople, if they don't approach their job inherently as problem solvers for their buyers, sure, we're just going to execute. We're going to make our calls. We're going to do our dials. Blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Then they never take time. And I think we see the outgrowth of that in terms of, quota attainment and the like, all the data we see.
Yeah.
So, white space in your people's calendars.
White space, and I'm going to look that book up. A minute to think. Thank you for the recommendation.
All right, Pouyan. Well, thank you so much for joining me. As always, a pleasure to chat with you.
Thanks for having me. Always enjoy our conversations.
Likewise. And if people want to connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
I'm on LinkedIn. Active there. Find me there. Pouyan Salehi. Look up Scratchpad. And if you want to email me, it's just my first name, last name at scratchpad.com.
All right. Excellent.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. I'm so grateful for your support of the show. And I want to thank our guest, Pouyan Salehi, for sharing his insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So thank you for your help with that. And as always, thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.